This is HashBang, featuring interviews and discussions about the latest in JavaScript and the JavaScript ecosystem. Brought to you by OKGrow, a JavaScript consulting and training company, building software to help our clients solve problems and create opportunities. Contact us at okgrow.com.
Welcome to HashBang. I'm Paul Dowman, founder of OKGrow. With me today is co-host Robert Dickert. Robert is a software engineer at OKGrow and previously was with the Meteor Development Group. And today our guest is Ben Lesh. Ben is a software engineer at Google and the maintainer of RxJS. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming.
Great to have you.
Yeah. So my goal for today is to learn about reactive programming and observables and learn how normal JavaScript developers can use this in their projects right now. So first of all, you've just recently moved to Google from Netflix. So how's your new job at Google?
It's great. It's great. I like it a lot. I like my the team I work with. It's a smart group of people and got some new fun challenges. So it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. The environment's really cool too. It's to describe it. If I had to describe it shortly, I would say Google's environment is kind of like college for grown-ups, and that there's a big campus, and they've got the eateries and all these other things. It's pretty exciting. But the challenges are neat. The scale is huge, and it's awesome.
That's pretty much what I've pictured from what I've heard about Google. That sounds really cool. And what do you work on there?
I work on a project called Alkali, which is a platform as a service that's based off of Angular with Java backend. So imagine, you work at Google and you want to spin up some googly app that has the profile chooser up in the corner and, the navigation along the left-hand side, that sort of thing. You can spin that up easily with Alkali, where if you were to try to roll it by hand within Google's infrastructure, it would be moderately difficult to get that done because you have to deal with all the infrastructure around our scale and everything. So
that's cool. We try to have something similar at OKGrow, obviously on a much more infinitesimally small scale than what you guys do. Try to have some core things to start a new project really quickly. So cool. And how long have you been writing code?
Oh boy. Well, writing code since I was probably 10-ish or so, I guess. Like I had a Commodore 64 and I wrote the pet basic on Commodore 64. And of course, then there was like Apple II, Apple IIe, those things. But I took a break in there, and I actually went to art school that's what I did as my college education. I went to art school. And towards the end of that, I decided that I didn't really want to do that for a living. So I left, and then I became a software engineer. I don't recommend that career path for everybody. It's not the easiest way to get into software engineering, but yeah. So I've professionally, I guess, since 1998. Oh, that's 19 years. It seems weird to say that, but
cool.
But yeah.
And so observables, I guess we'll get to it, an explanation of what it is shortly. But how did you come to be working on that or be interested in that as like part of your architecture?
Well, the first time I actually heard of RxJS was when I started at Netflix. Netflix was pretty big on it at the time, and Netflix actually, they hired me for my Angular expertise, and then I ended up working on an Ember app and later on React apps. But when I was working on that Ember app, we had this large real-time streaming data visualization application. So you can imagine tons of data flowing in and updating 20, 30 graphs on a page. In order to get all those graphs to update, we had like a WebSocket coming in, and we were doing some functional programming to transform what was coming off of that WebSocket. But we were doing it with like array map, array filter, array reduce, these things. And what would happen is it would work fine, but over time, the pages would just lock up. So I looked into a variety of solutions, and of course, like I said, RxJS is really bigger on Netflix, and I thought, okay, well, I'll try this. But when I first saw RxJS, I just thought, this looks like another Lodash. Why in the world would I need this kind of thing? Like it it didn't occur to me what the value was. But um, when I started using Rx, it was because, okay, well, I can wrap this socket in Rx, and then if I wrap the socket in Rx, I can do these transformations in such a way that it's done step by step instead of creating new arrays over and over again, where I'd have to iterate over the arrays and do garbage collection, which is going to lock my thread. I can use RxJS for this, and it does away with those intermediary arrays and cleans up the garbage collection problem for us. And that solved the problem of our app locking up. And then I started to get more into it and got into doing some performance tuning in the rest of our app. And I happened to work alongside some folks in the ReactiveX community, and they saw that I had, a strong focus on performance. So they asked me if I would be interested in rewriting RxJS to make it a little faster for Netflix's needs. And my first response was, I think there's about 4 or 5 other people that are a better choice for this. And I listed them off, and they were insistent. So I started working on it, like prototyping it, and getting a lot of help from the existing RxJS community, Matt Pawasecki, who's the original creator, and these other folks. And yeah, so it's gone from there, I guess.
Cool. Well, maybe this is a good time to ask what exactly reactive programming is. What is RxJS and observables? Can you explain that?
Okay, well, reactive programming, it's kind of a higher concept where the idea is you write your application such that you can write it in small chunks that kind of react to events that occur. So you have an event that gives you some value, you do something with it, and then you dispatch another event, and then somebody else reacts to that, and so on. So your application can be broken into smaller chunks that kind of don't care about whatever is giving in the event. It just cares that it got an event and it's going to do something with it. So that's kind of more of a push-based reactive programming. There's also pull-based reactive programming, which is a little bit looser. I know some people don't believe that there is, but the idea behind that would be similar, except for you say, I want a value, and then each step says, oh, this step wants a value. I'm going to pull a value from upstream, transform it in some way, and send it down. That's also still kind of reactive programming, but it's just pull-based. So RxJS is push-based reactive programming. Observables are a push-based primitive. A lot of people think it's an async type. It's not necessarily always async, so it's a misnomer, but it's a push-based primitive. So the idea around observables is basically we're going to take an observer, which is just an object with next method, an error method, and a complete method, just our handlers, these 3 handlers, and we're going to tie it to something that's producing data. Now that thing that's producing data could be another observable, which is that's how operators work in RxJS, or it could be a WebSocket or user events or whatever. So that's it in a nutshell. But basically, it's just a function that takes 3 handlers and ties those 3 handlers to something, essentially. But those 3 handlers are in an object shape, and that's for a variety of reasons. So that's RxJS. And then RxJS the current version is actually built to match. There's an observable proposal for JavaScript that I think is still stage 1. It might be stage 2 now. I'd have to double check because there's been some recent movement on it. But the idea is to try to match that. So someday observables will land in the browser, and then RxJS just becomes all of these operators you can use on observables, because those operators can't or won't exist in the browser itself.
Yeah, I guess I think I'll just quote one thing that Jafar Hussain said about observables, which is that they're asynchronous collections that arrive over time. I thought I'd mention it because in case anyone that's listening is if it's feeling like pretty abstract to them, what do you think about that description of okay, it's a collection, you can map over it, you can filter it. It makes it a little bit more concrete for people. Yeah.
So Jafar's a good friend of mine, and I worked with him when I worked at Netflix, actually. He once conveyed to me that he was upset that he ever called it an async anything because it makes some of the arguments harder in say the TC39 because it's kind of put forth this misnomer that it's always an async primitive and it can be totally synchronous. So it is push-based primitive, but the overarching idea, you're right, is that it's about having a collection. So if you have this push-based primitive and you know it's going to push some n number of values at you, you can treat it like a collection of things. And when you have a collection of things, you get into like category theory type stuff where you can say, well, I know that collections can be concatenated, like joined end to end. I know that collections can be, they can be filtered, they can be joined, they can be mapped, they can be transformed in various ways. With observables, it becomes slightly more interesting because there's also a temporal element to it, right? There's the matter of time. It's not just like an array, where an array is always like a synchronous thing. You can go through the whole thing at once. You have with observables this idea that there's some amount of time between values arriving sometimes. So you can do things like debounce and throttle and that sort of thing. You can't debounce an array. That wouldn't make any sense. But with an observable, you can do these things. But the idea is that what you're doing is you're taking, with an operator, you're taking a set of values and you're transforming it into a new set of values in some way. So that's the whole principle behind RxJS.
So we could rephrase that from being asynchronous collections that arrive over time to just thinking of it as collections that arrive over time. Would that still?
Yeah. So yeah, and it's any number of values over any amount of time.
Okay.
So it could be infinite values right now or like one value 10 years from now. It's the same thing.
I have a question around that. So like it sounds like a very functional approach, which is something I really appreciate. But like, so if you're talking to people who are thinking about using observables, but they haven't used it before, what would this replace? Like what things would they use less of when they start using observables, and why would they be happy that they were switching to observables?
The things that you end up using less of are usually things like you end up using slightly less, say, event targets, or which is like, add event listener, remove event listener, those sorts of things. You end up using fewer promises. One of the things about observables is observables are lazy and cancelable, and promises are not. So in your observable, you can have it embody the setup and tear down of something, which means that you can, send out an AJAX request and then abort it, by unsubscribing from it or whatever, where you would never be able to do that really with a promise without doing some weird functional acrobatics in whatever's creating the promise. So like this generally what you see is people find fewer reasons to use promises. Promises do have their place. There's nothing wrong with them. If you have a situation where you have one value that's going to arrive always asynchronously and you never ever want to cancel it for whatever reason, promises are great. Like that's the ideal use case for a promise. And there's full interop with promises in RxJS. Like anywhere you can return an observable in Rx, you can return a promise and it'll just be like, oh, I know what this is. But generally people find themselves using fewer and fewer of those. The use case around it is things like, for example, there's async function star right now. An async function star is going to return an iterator of promises, which is really good. It's really good for things where you want back pressure, where you're saying, I'm processing things as quick as I can, but I don't want to overload my client, with elements from the server. It works pretty good for that. But in situations for like mouse movements or something, it's not going to work as well because, yes, mouse movements arrive over time, but it's going to spam you with like, thousands of instances of promise, and that's not ideal. Where an observable is not going to have that problem. It's just going to push the mouse events at you and be a lot more lightweight. So
that makes sense. Yeah. Do you find, like, since it sounds like you came from a really strong Angular background, doing a lot with that now, but you also have had exposure to React and maybe other frameworks. Do you find that people are using them or need observables in different ways between those frameworks, or is it kind of the same?
So I wrote some large apps in Ember and React previously. Honestly, I'm just now getting more into Angular 2 and up. I had a strong background in Angular 1 before any of this. And I find that people will use them in every one of those, with the exception, I would say, of Ember, because Ember is a really like, it's a really paved road sort of ecosystem where doing anything that's not what the Ember community normally does is kind of frowned upon. But I mean, that's not to say we used Rx really heavily with Ember, at Netflix. But I know that the larger Ember community doesn't really do that. React's Wild West enough that there's people that because React is just a rendering layer. So there's all these different ways of state management that people have cooked up, and people use Redux, and then they'll use Redux and Redux Saga, or they'll use Redux and Redux Observable, which is something that I worked on with Jay Phelps because we were on the same team together and we needed it. That uses Rx to manage like the kind of the async side of Redux. There's people that use just Rx with React. And then there's people that use like MobX and other things in React. So Angular, I'd say it's more common because Angular treats it as a first-class thing and has some dependency on it. So the Angular community seems to be more fully embracing it, or at least getting more exposure to it. What I find is when people get exposure to Rx, like if they play with it and they'll kind of, if they jump into somebody else's Rx code base and they're not the ones that wrote it, they're like, oh my God, this is the worst thing ever. Why did anyone write this? And then, but if they start at it from, oh, I'm trying to do this thing, the minute they do something even somewhat clever, like they use like a throttle time on something or whatever they're doing, all of a sudden they're like, whoa, this is super cool. And then the next thing they do is they write like this huge mountain of horrible Rx code because they're super excited about it. But yeah, it's kind of the gateway in. So I think the Angular community is probably more into it than the other communities, with like React being more of a runner-up in that category as far as like level of interest in RxJS.
So what are the things that you would recommend to use it for mostly? Like, I think the reason why I'm asking is there's a lot of people who are like just struggling to keep abreast of like new tools that are coming at them all the time, and I'm wondering what type of problems would that if you're having this particular thing or finding something complex in your app, what would you like which of those types of things would Rx be a great solution for?
Well, for a couple things. One is RxJS is not really a new tool. It's been around for like 8 or 9 years, believe it or not.
Yes.
But it's become more popular recently. The stuff that I recommend Rx for is pretty much anything where you have to coordinate events in some complicated way. So for example, you could do like a drag and drop, or actually most recently there's NG Cruise. It was this conference I did a talk at, and my talk there, I showed how to implement a feature to do, like, Twitter, you can drag down from the top with a touch. Mm-hmm. And if you drag far enough, it'll load, new data, and then it animates the thing back up. Otherwise, if you don't drag far enough, it just animates it back up.
Right.
Like composing that, I mean, you're looking at a drag and drop. So that's a touch, a touch start, touch moves, and touch ends. That's the drag and drop part. You're looking at animations, which are another form of async that you want to track with your observable. You're looking at multiple animations, one to go up, one to sit there and spin, and you're looking at async around making an AJAX request to go get some data and that sort of thing. So, when you're doing stuff like that, Rx is ideal because you can handle that in a really, really terse amount of code where, doing it imperatively is liable to be buggy and hard to do. Like, one of the nicer things about Rx actually is we've got a couple things. Is one, if you've kind of learned the way to do it, you end up writing a lot of pure functions, and you end up writing a lot of code that's kind of safe from having weird side effects and race conditions. And then the other thing is there's deterministic memory management built into Rx. So if you're your async process is done, you have this unsubscribe semantic in RxJS that just happens for you a lot of times, and it will clean up memory or remove event listeners and these things that you normally have to do manually if you're writing imperative code. So I recommend it for those reasons and kind of those use cases. If you're just writing something where you're like, I'm going to click a button and make a thing pop up, and it's like, no, you just write a click handler and make your thing pop up. Whatever you're doing with Rx is crazy. You don't need that. But if you're doing something where you want to click a button and add some delay, then maybe Rx is starting to become the right choice. So,
And it seems like you might end up with more testable code for those types of things.
Yeah. The code is more testable. Although I find that, especially working on the team I'm on here, is they have folks that are kind of new to Rx, and for some reason there's a long mental leap for people to go from testing imperative code to testing Rx. But generally the code is more testable, because what all you should need to do is kind of pump values into the head of your observable chain, and then assure that the values coming out of the tail of your observable chain are coming out in the manner you expect. So that's really how you end up testing Rx in a nutshell. So it should end up being more testable, because everything that happens in between is either a small piece of code that's a pure function that you could test on its own, which is easy, or it's code written in a library that's tested with like 2,600 unit tests. So it should be pretty solid.
Right. And speaking of pure functional things, you mentioned another use for it, which is like asynchronous loading of data. So maybe can you tell us a bit about that, like where people are using Redux Thunk or Sagas or something? How does it compare?
So yeah. Well, I mean, like when people are using Redux Thunk or Redux Sagas, I mean, what they're really doing in there is usually they're using some sort of promise or something like that, and they're all fine approaches, but it's going to be much more imperative. Like Redux Saga, I think, uses like a generator pattern where it's got some things that you're expected to yield from the generator that cause certain behaviors to occur, that are either async or like a delay or something like that. Those things are fine, but they are more imperative. It doesn't make them any more or less testable, but it does make them a little less flexible. And there are some foot guns laying around, especially with things like generators, where you could, if you do something that's going to instantiate a very big expensive object, like up here and then like up the top and then down lower, you have like 2 or 3 more yields that happen over time, and then you use it again at the bottom, then that thing gets scoped all the way through, and you end up keeping that large thing in memory the whole time. But people don't really realize that they're doing that. They just kind of think, oh, this is one function because it looks like one function. So it's not like, there's some mental math you have to do there. We don't run into that quite as much with Rx, or even with, honestly, or even with using promises directly with then, and so on. Like you would see less of that behavior there. But yeah, I think that, I don't know, the paradigms that people use for loading async things, the biggest thing is a lot of them rely on promises, and promises lack that cancellation semantic. So they lack that cleanup. And what that means is someone's going to make an AJAX request, like whenever you say you navigate to some route in your React app or whatever you're doing, and then it goes and it makes some AJAX request to get some data. And when you bring it back, you want to do something expensive, or maybe send another AJAX request based off of whatever you got back. I mean, these are all things we've seen in apps before. And what happens is the user goes to that route and it goes, nope, I don't want that. And then they go to some other route. Well, if it's a promise, then it's going to come back. It's probably going to parse your request. It's definitely going to parse your request. Then maybe if you're smart, you have something in there that's a little Boolean check that says, hey, do we still care about this? No? Okay, then forget it. Don't do all this other stuff.
Right.
But more than likely, someone's going to be like, oops, I forgot to add that. So it's still going to process everything, and it's going to go on to the next step, maybe send another AJAX request, wait for that to come back, do something else. And it's doing all this in the background to update a view that you're no longer displaying.
Yep.
and just it's wasting CPU cycles and process.
Potentially giving you errors on lifecycle callbacks and things like that. I've seen that.
Right. Yeah. It's could cause all sorts of weird things to happen.
Yeah.
So I have a question. So like for anyone that's listening that may have heard you interviewed on other podcasts or whatever, I think it's been a while since you've talked about this, and maybe there have been some updates or changes either in the library or around the standards process. Do you want to tell us what's been going on in the last 6 months or so?
Sure. So there's a few. I mean, there's some minor updates as far as the proposal goes that I'm not sure people are aware of. That are things like right now, RxJS. If you throw an error and somewhere in your observable chain and it makes it all the way down to the bottom and you don't have an error handler, what it does is it rethrows that error, which a lot of people view as a nicer behavior than what promises do, which is kind of swallow it. But there are problems with actually doing this, because if you are multicasting anywhere in your chain, which means that you're sharing one observable with many consumers, then what happens is you rethrow that error, and at that point you're multicasting, there's actually a loop that's saying, hey, notify everybody. And so that error percolates all the way back up to your loop, kills the loop, and then ceases to notify the other folks that you were supposed to notify. And the only way to get around that would be to schedule them to happen at a later time, like asynchronously. And if you schedule it to happen asynchronously, then throwing an error wouldn't matter, because you couldn't possibly catch an asynchronous error with a try catch. There's the shorter version of this is that behavior is going to end up getting removed. But that's probably not going to affect most people. More interesting than that is there's an ongoing, the shift in what we're focused on with RxJS has gone from trying to make things as fast as possible in terms of CPU cycles to trying to reduce the size of the library to make those initial load times a lot better for web apps and for things that are like Electron apps. Slack is an app actually that uses RxJS. So for those sorts of things, and there's a lot involved in doing that as far as trying to move around where error handling is and trying to refactor some of the operators. And there's another thing that we're trying to solve, which is currently what we do to add operators in a way that is least impactful to people's apps is we have this patch operator thing where we say import RxJS / add operator map or add operator merge map or whatever you're adding. And what that ends up doing is it takes the operator and it adds it to Observables prototype, which sounds great in practice. And usually for people's end users' apps, it's totally fine. What happens, though, is people will write libraries. Like Falcor Router was one that I worked on. Angular in a few spots does this. They'll write libraries and they'll use these patch operators. And that adds these operators to the observable prototype. And then what happens is you have people start to depend on those operators being there. The library decides they no longer need the operator, they remove it, and you break people. Even though you think you made a non-breaking change, like you actually end up breaking other people because they were depending on something you were adding. So to get around that, what we're trying to do is move our operators over to lettable functions. And what I mean by lettable is there is a method on observable called let, and let takes a function that you give an observable, and that gives you an observable, and you're expected to return a new observable. So what we can do is we can write a higher order function called map, let's say, and map will take a projection function and then return to you a function that takes an observable and returns an observable. So you should be able to write all of the same operators with higher order functions inside of something like let. TypeScript actually pushed through a great feature for this, just kind of at my prompting, because it was something that was necessary for this to really work well with TypeScript, which is type inference back through kind of more functional chains like that. So we can have a compose function that can take a rest of multiple functions, and it can figure out that, the first function takes type observable A and returns observable B, and the second function takes observable B and returns observable C, and so on. And the whole thing ends up returning observable E or whatever whatever the very last one is. So you can get type inference through that. But the big change is that operators will no longer be used with dot chaining in the future. You'll want to be using them with these higher order functions. There's a lot of really awesome, amazing benefits to this, but it makes writing your own operators easier and more testable. It makes actual operator chains that are not attached to observables more reusable. There's a lot of interesting side effects to this, but one of them also is that I think it's going to help us reduce the size of the library a little bit. Better tree shaking. That's another big thing. If you take all of the operators and you stick them on the prototype, even if you don't use them, there's no way for a tree shaker to tell that you didn't use them, right? So because they look used, they got put on a prototype. So if you're actually importing them as functions and then using them or not using them, then a tree shaker can go through and be like, oh, well, you didn't use map at all, so I can just delete that code in the output bundle. So that's a really big deal.
Cool.
That's really cool.
Are you still working on all of these things or not still, but are you working on all these things as part of your day job at Google, or is this something that you have to squeeze in?
No. A lot of people think that my full-time job at Google is working on RxJS, and it is just simply not the case. It's part of, I do work on as my 20% project here at Google. Realistically, though, I'm a tech lead on my team, so I don't have probably a full 20% of my time to do stuff like that. So I tend to work on it in my spare time. If I really pushed, if I pushed around here and was like, look, I need to make sure that I spend one whole day a week to work on this, I probably would get that. But my team has important goals too, and people that depend on me. So it's important that I focus on those things while I'm here. But I also deeply care about RxJS, so I do spend a good amount of my free time on it, much to my wife's chagrin sometimes, I think.
So I assume you could use some contributors if anybody's looking to dig into something deep. You should probably go look at issues and things on RxJS. Yeah,
the biggest thing we need contribution around is docs. Like documentation is. I don't have a hard time finding time for some of the technical heavy lifting, but like finding people that are good at writing documentation or good at writing up examples and contributing them that's a lot harder.
That sounds like a good way in to actually learn the concepts better as well too.
Oh yeah, so that's one of the keys to my career just absolutely accelerating was. One day I decided ages ago that I was going to start answering questions on Stack Overflow that I didn't know the answers to. And that's actually how Netflix found me. But what ends up happening is if you're answering questions or you're writing blogs or you're doing anything like that or doing a talk, you end up having to learn the material better than you'd have to know it just to use the material.
Yep.
Because just to use the material, technically you could just copy and paste an answer and be like, oh, look, it worked. And I know kind of why it worked, but I don't really care. I got to move on with my life. If you have to teach somebody else, then if you are a conscientious person at all, you're going to be like, oh man, I really need to know this really well because I don't want to teach people the wrong thing because then they'll teach the wrong. It's like this horrible thing. Or, at best, you'll just look like an idiot. At worst, you actually cause damage to people, right? So it's really, really big deal to get out there. If you want to write docs for people, it's a great way to learn new things. If you want to answer questions on Stack Overflow or whatever you want to do, find questions you don't know the answer to and answer those.
That's exactly why we teach training classes at OK Grow. It's just because you get all kinds of, you just don't realize how much you don't know something, and until you learn it and you start trying to prepare some training for it, then you start digging in, like you said. And people ask all kinds of questions that you really need to prepare for.
Yeah, I can tell you that even as the author of a library, sometimes I learn things about my own library when I'm thinking, oh, I have to teach this to somebody. Like, what am I not thinking of? It's the best way to get your career going for sure, especially if you put it out there for other people.
Speaking of teaching, you do teach training for RxJS, and I see you have an upcoming class on September 9th.
Yeah. RX Workshop. You can find it at rxworkshop.com. There's signups for September 9th. Doing both online and in person. I think that I want to say the September 9th one is online. I'd have to double check, but it's great. It's great fun. I love teaching the class. I love teaching people about RxJS and about anything really. Partially because I learn a lot from the students. I've met some really great people and made some friends doing it as well that are students that have come in. So it's a lot of fun. I recommend it.
Cool.
That's great.
Excellent. Well, we're kind of getting towards the end of our time, but Robert, was there anything that we should have touched on that we didn't?
I'd like to maybe just ask a little bit about the TC39 proposal. I have a couple things I'm curious about. One is how doing that proposal affected the library, or like what the interaction was back and forth, and then also if there, I guess, how do you feel about like the progress of that, and how sure are you that it will make it through that whole process, and do you have any idea of when that will be?
So the way that it affected the library is that, I mean, it affected so RxJS prior had observer methods like on next, on error, on completed, and you got back a disposable that had a dispose method on it. Now it's got next, error, and complete, and you get back a subscription that has an unsubscribe on it. So like the ways that it affected the project are more to that, like this kind of the shape of it. And then of course there's the change I mentioned earlier with like the error rethrowing and stuff like that. So like it has caused a good amount of really smart people to pay more attention to what the behaviors are and kind of affect those things and the shape. But on the other side, you know, what are its chances of getting through the TC39? I don't know. It's sat in stage 1 for so long, but you know, a lot of it is because there are quite a few members of the TC39 who they're not familiar with observable. They're not very familiar with like the reactive programming, like the way that it's used in application development. So you know, their job is to it's better to not add a feature and let users add a feature than it is to add a feature and realize they've added it mistakenly or added it with problems later on. And, you know, like some people would disagree with this statement, but, you know, I think promises can be kind of an example of that. So, because everyone knows that there's some weird edge casey problems with promises. But I think that, you know, given some time and the fact that, you know, I know Netflix is really pushing for it. I know that RxJS has a good amount of momentum in places like Facebook and especially at Google now. I think that given some time, something like it will definitely land in JavaScript. It's just my opinion. Whether or not it'll land this time, or like how long it'll take the proposal to get through, I couldn't tell you. But I know that there's an awful lot of people that are pushing for it. And most of the push against it is more from the aspect of, I'm not sure we need it because I'm not sure I understand it, rather than from any sort of principled position of this is bad because of X, Y, or Z. Right. So that alone tells me that it's more positive than negative. But again, you know, how do you find time to get all these people to understand it and to make sure that it can be pushed through or you know, whatever. At the same time, you know, while RxJS operates as a great reference implementation too, it might also work against the proposal getting through a little bit, because they can point and say, well, you already have this library here. Why do we need to ship these things to the browser? My argument for that would be that it would make this library a lot smaller, and it would also make observables themselves, ideally, it would make them a lot faster. It also, I think, makes a nice type for things like a decent replacement for event target. So event target being the add and remove event listener type thing.
Yeah, it might pave the way for other things, the way promises did for async await, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Well, I think unless there's anything else that we missed.
No.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to tell us about that. If anyone is interested in learning more about it, there's obviously your class, but where else would you direct them to?
You can ping me on Twitter. You can find me on Twitter at Ben Lesh. So I'm always there. I'm always around. I do try to respond to everybody that has RxJS questions if I can. Some weeks are busier than others, but I definitely do try to respond there.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank
That's
you very
great.
much. That was
All right, thanks,
a
guys.
lot.
informative for me. Thanks, Ben.
You've been listening to HashBang, brought to you by OK Grow, a JavaScript consulting and training company. Contact us at okgrow.com.